Oh, it's preparing. Got it. Oh, it's preparing. Okay. So now we are live.
Great.
Okay, so hi, how are you, Jordan? I will go ahead and kick us off. First of all, I know there's a lot going on in the world, and it is a very tense time globally. Okay, so hi, how are you, Jordan? I will go ahead and kick us off. I apologize, there's a reverb happening here. Okay, great. And I wanted to thank you, Jordan, for wanting to acknowledge that this is National Eating Disorder Awareness Week, and to share your personal story. So I know this is deeply personal, and I didn't know this about you until you shared that you wanted to have this conversation. So thank you for being vulnerable and willing to share. And I prepared a couple of things, just a real quick grounder for us before we start asking you some questions on what is an eating disorder and how common they are and what types, and would love to kind of get into some of the questions for you. But you did just remind me that it's been 5 years since we've been doing this. I know there's been a lot of fits and starts with so much going on with life and in the world, but it's always good to come back and ground us in continuing to learn and grow in this space. So thank you. So I've actually got this from Johns Hopkins, who actually has a recovery program, and they've advised, I'm learning a whole lot and realized this is very common for us as women in the Western world to be rather obsessed. And this is prevalent around the globe, as we talked about in our colorism sessions, that the whiteness and the predominant standard of beauty is propagated globally. So what is an eating disorder? It is defined as a psychiatric illness that centers on food and its consumption, and are usually characterized by excessive preoccupation with food and dissatisfaction with one's body shape or weight. And that seemed like such a huge overarching umbrella that impacts so many women and men. It also gets, as it gets more narrower, it becomes a compulsion to engage in extreme eating habits and unhealthy methods of weight control, including fasting and binge eating, excessive exercise, self-induced vomiting, chewing and spitting or regurgitating food, excessive laxative, diuretic, or diet pill abuse. So these unhealthy behaviors and preoccupations get worse over time and becomes kind of an all-consuming passion. And it really seemed to kind of border on unhealthy thinking and habits to like, I guess the next degree of illness when it interferes with your physical, psychological, and social well-being. So I was curious if you had any sort of thoughts or reactions to that, and willing to share some of your personal experience.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I want to thank everybody, on a Sunday and celebrating our 5 years here. But yeah, I was really looking forward to talking about this because, like you said, we haven't, had a discussion devoted to it in the salon before. And I think that, I have mentioned it just at different times, but there was a podcast I did with a friend of mine a few years ago called Grief Relief, where she talked with me for an episode about my experience with anxiety disorder and OCD. And so that I think is the first time that I shared in that context, my experience with eating disorders, because the description that you just shared, there is a lot of overlap. A lot of ED behaviors are very ritualistic. And like you said, when it becomes a compulsion for someone to do those things, that's a sign that it's, it is an illness and something that they need to seek help for. So, it can be something that is separate. Maybe somebody doesn't have a history of an anxiety disorder, or they can be co-occurring and, lead to other illnesses along the way. But yeah, it is definitely something that, affects a lot of people.
Yeah, some of the stats you shared, almost 10% of the global population is a victim to this. Some of the common eating disorders that we are probably really familiar with: anorexia nervosa, which is self-starvation; bulimia nervosa, where you binge and purge. There is a binge eating disorder where the purging doesn't necessarily help, but you compensate with like occasional vomiting, but excessive exercise, laxative abuse. And there is something called AFRID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, where people just, I guess, just lose interest in food, avoid textures or types of food, have fears, anxieties about eating certain types of food. And that's not necessarily always tied to shape and weight, but that seems to be kind of that fixative behavior. And also pica, where folks want to eat non-food items as a way to cope with some of the other, I guess, the rootedness of, I think you just touched on something that kind of ties back, which is, it's rooted in controlling or dealing with other issues. It's a disease in and of itself, but also symptomatic of something else. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that in terms of your experience. You mentioned your anxiety, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's really important to highlight, as we're talking about that less than 6% of people with eating disorders are going to present as like medically underweight. So it doesn't always look the same in people. And that's, something that is important when we're looking at treatment. But yeah, the underlying reasons for someone having disordered eating usually go like far beyond weight. Like, one of the common myths is that it's a vanity disease. And, for most folks, it isn't just rooted in like how they look or meeting a beauty standard. That does go a long way, especially in the US, to, kind of supporting those symptoms. But 28 to 74% of people, they have a genetic hereditability. And so that is also a big factor. And, a lot of people report having experienced sexual harassment or abuse. And so like that type of trauma, especially for women, can influence the, desire to control just, our bodies. And those are coping mechanisms to like mediate how we feel in ourselves. And, whether you receive like unwanted attention, positive or negative. And so it's like, for all types of eating disorders, that's a commonality. But yeah, like you said, other types of things, depression can either happen before or, as a result of experiencing eating disorders. And, anxiety, for me, having OCD, which is one of many anxiety disorders, that was something that developed before my disordered eating habits. And, I think that now, when I first developed the eating issues, it was about almost 20 years ago. So it's been a long time. But, in doing the prep for this talk, I just realized that um, even though the occurrence, was several years ago, it really lasted for a significant time of my life. And, um, my teens and early 20s, like uh, it can really affect people for long spans of time. And so I think that's really, highlights the need to seek help when you're aware of something. Um, and, like in my experience, I developed a lot of those habits, as a coping mechanism for like going through extreme changes and transitions in my life. So, I had started high school at a time where I left a lot of my friends at another school. I had been recently diagnosed with OCD, and that affected the time or the extent to which I was able to participate in other things that used to be healthy coping mechanisms. And so having like a dance background, I temporarily stopped dancing, and I couldn't go to ballet class. And interestingly enough, I didn't have an experience of disordered eating while I was in dance. And in a lot of cases, dance can be used as like a kind of mediator or therapeutic outlet for people with anxiety. But yeah, when I stopped dancing and started a new school, took a while to get acclimated and make friends. And beyond that, I also experienced my parents struggling in their relationship. And so I think it was like probably my whole sophomore year of high school, or like 16. That's a hard time for a lot of people. That I was just kind of checked out and like not restricting, but just like emotional eating, and not really talking about it. And so I think maybe around the time that like that caught up to me, and I became like conscious of, okay, this is what I'm doing. I kind of started to just be mindful about it, but with the culture being what it is, that also kicked into like just obsession about it, and restricting and ritualistic behaviors. And so that was kind of like the catalyst for the anorexia. And I think there, like we said, it goes undiagnosed in a lot of people, and it can affect people of all races and genders and sizes. People don't have to look underweight to have this issue, or any of the other eating disorders. And yeah, like I later on went to develop pretty much all the other ones too, except for I think pica. But yeah, I guess to my credit, I just kind of self-reported, and I know that's really hard for a lot of people. But yeah, I had gone on a trip with my family, which was supposed to be, something really fun and enjoyable. We went out of the country, and it was like spring break of my junior year of high school. And, I just realized I was miserable the whole time because I spent it like deathly afraid of what I was going to eat.
Mm.
And yeah, like with no energy too. I mean, I remember periods of like that time when I was in school where I had a hard time like just staying awake because like my body wasn't getting enough like
Fuel.
yeah, like my brain was just so foggy. So yeah, I think like I was just really like, I can't continue this way. And chose to ask for help. I talked to my mom, who was really supportive about it, and went to go and see a doctor who worked along with a nutritionist. And so it was really helpful for me to have like a team, and people who had experience treating these issues, but also just were in communication with each other. And that was kind of the start of that. Like I said, several years ago now, but it didn't happen overnight. It was a process. And I think like it's totally real to experience anxiety as you're going through treatment too. Just like, even if you know that you want to get help and change, if someone is underweight, the process of like refeeding can be really scary and uncomfortable. And I think somebody just sent me a question asking if I can talk about what things did help, and encourage me. And I think that's going to be different for everybody, slightly, but I would encourage anyone who does realize that they have any of these symptoms, to go seek professional help if it's available. And I know that access to mental health treatment is another issue culturally and in our society. So that's a barrier that needs to be removed. But if you're able to go see a counselor, even if it's just at your school, or someone who you can connect to from an employer, I think that goes a long way to getting you support. But for me, I really had to relearn just like how to listen to my body and be able to sit in it. I think for a lot of people, whether they have anorexia or bulimia or another issue, the commonality is like a numbness and feeling like you're not in your body, because whatever kind of feelings or discomfort that's causing those symptoms, you kind of temporarily check out when you're under eating or overeating. But like being able to like have a meal with family and then just kind of sit with the discomfort, sit with the anxiety, like hold space for all of my feelings, and then also just be like, okay, these are what hunger cues feel like. This is how I know I'm full, and like getting used to all of that again was really important. And like that's a big step. Just being able to go to support groups and talk with people, or just talk to more people in my personal life about it and like how I was feeling, was really helpful. Having just any kind of outlet where you can express whatever you're feeling, that's something that you're using the eating to cope with, is important, because then you have an outlet that's healthy. And I think for me, like decoupling the idealized body image from my personal experience was easier than it might be for other people, especially anybody in an image-based industry. Like I said, dancers, actors, performers of any type. That's really hard, when that's your body is your medium. And people often judge based on that. But I think that it is really just a process, and it's a big step to realize that you're also more than that. And your appearance really has nothing to do with who you are as a person. It's uh,
That's right.
genetic, and yeah, we all have to come to grips with that. But it's like, yeah, no limitation on what you can do. And yeah, I think especially in like uh, society that privileges white, cisgender, um, heteronormative people, like we also have to highlight that that's not the vast majority. So
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, I read an interesting study in that in some cultures that have not been exposed to Western beauty standards, the eating disorders are almost non-existent. But that aside, given where we are, you had touched on something that was really interesting, and your story helped like elucidate that most eating disorders arise, like 90% of them are women, young women, as early as age 10 up to about mid-20s. And when you're that young, there's so little in your life that you can control, and that becomes the coping mechanism of choice for some folks. And I'm curious, as you were seeking treatment, what are some of the tools that they gave you so that you didn't have to use food to cope, but other channels, like you talked about talking to friends, but what were some of the other tools that you've received?
yeah, depending on what type of therapy you seek out, people might do exposure tasks. And so
What's that?
ERP is exposure response prevention, and it gets you into just like real world scenarios or things that will most likely come up, where you practice not engaging in your compulsion or whatever kind of behavior you're trying to correct, like in response to the situation. So if it's like going out with friends, and something with that a lot of people with eating disorders stop doing because of the shame and anxiety around it or stigma, um, and having to control what they eat, you might practice and say, your therapist will have you eat a small amount of whatever it is you're afraid of eating, um, and then
It's literally like exposure therapy.
yeah, like you try for I don't know, maybe 5 minutes or however long you're able to not do your eating disorder behaviors, to not restrict or try to overexercise, or purge. And like, you do that until you're just able to, not, and you it's not like a limited amount of time, you just don't do the behavior.
But the underlying, anxiety or the need for control, even if the behaviors change, that hasn't changed. So how did you deal with some of the tough, other tough things that were going on in your life? And if you couldn't turn to food to do it?
Yeah. I think, for me, like with OCD, it's just important to understand that and I think a lot of other anxiety disorders can like evolve and manifest in different ways. And so um, some of the things that people are taught in like dieting programs about how to calculate all of their calories and how often to check their weight and stuff like that, those are things that I just for the most part don't do anymore. And for a lot of people with the history of eating disorders or who are in recovery, you just can't do them because they, I think for people even without these issues, can bring up a lot of shame and just discomfort. But also it can kind of kick into um, you doing disordered behaviors again. So I mean, now things that I have been able to do that help me maintain recovery, are just things that I think are life affirming. Doing a lot more of, my work in art, and even if it's not going to a dance class, or teaching, which I started doing in the past year. I think doing projects like this, whatever it is, if you have experience or passion that you've wanted to channel into something and haven't started, those types of things take a lot of time and, usually a lot of focus too. So whatever I think distracts or redirects your attention from disordered eating is a good thing, because, then yeah, your mind, you're focused on it. Um,
You literally don't have time to obsess.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So last night when I don't know if it was good preparation or bad, but there was a film on Netflix called To the Bone, and it was a movie about eating disorder recovery. And in it, I thought it was humorous but also really touching. There was a scene where the two they were in an inpatient recovery, and if you hit some sort of weight, you get a treat to like leave the compound and go to a restaurant. And they were sitting across from each other, and she was the act of swallowing was really tough, I guess. So she would chew and spit into a napkin, and that was a whole scene around that. So it was like the two things there was the whole inpatient side of things. I'm curious if you had any experience to that, and then if it was and curious any sort of thought you might have to the mastication, the swallowing versus just the control of the intake.
um, I don't have personal experience with the inpatient treatment. And that's not to say that I didn't research or hear about certain programs when I was in treatment, but yeah, I just didn't go to any. So I can't speak to that. I know that fortunately, those are options for a lot of people, and some of them are really successful. But I think that anybody who is in these disordered habits for a while can kind of have issues with, like, their digestion and all of those things, and just it becomes a challenge. And so working through that, I think it gets better over time. I haven't seen that documentary yet, but
It's a movie with Keanu Reeves in it, but it's actually quite beautiful.
okay.
Yeah, beautifully
Yeah,
done.
we love Keanu. We'll have to check that out. Yeah, but I mean, anything, whether it's fictional or documentary, any kind of media that brings attention to these issues and those types of stories, I think is really good. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think that something else that has helped me, that I talked with another friend about recently, is just like changing my perspective and the way that I'm involved with dance, which is for just the sheer love of it, and not to try and regulate my weight. I think that really helps a lot. Everybody, I guess, has a different reason for why they move their bodies and why they exercise. But I mean, like, essentially, yeah, it's a need for all of us, just like sleeping and eating. Like, we also have to eat. And
we also have to move. Yeah,
we have to move. I think some really good things that I read recently were that it's important to focus on the feeling when we're doing that. And if you're only focusing on, the numbers or like kind of how to negate what you eat when you're moving, you're missing out on, the primary benefits that doing that can give you.
Mm.
Um, and so like healing your relationship with movement is another big step. Less like exercising to earn food or to burn calories, and like, ideally not doing something that you don't want to do. Like, yeah, only moving in ways that you want to. Because I think a lot of people also end up just, mindlessly exercising, and it's not even something they like. But, I think like movement as self-care is really a big thing. It's important. One of our group members, and also one of my relatives, a cousin, Tammy Winfrey Harris, has like a really big yoga practice, and is now a certified yoga instructor, something that, yeah, I'm really excited about. She worked for over the years, and, talks a lot about movement and yoga for people in larger bodies, which I think is awesome. And like, yeah, something that's good for everybody, but that is just like major, and something that's inclusive, that I think is really supportive. Exercising to just feel good, because
I mean, the mental health benefits, right? Like just clearing your mind, being able to like sweat out a piece of stress is fantastic. And I've gotten in the habit of, when I was reading the description of eating disorders, I think so many of us have some degree of that kind of behavior and thinking, and just kind of coming back to the body and feeling gratitude for, like I am very fortunate that I am able-bodied and able to run and walk whenever and anytime, whenever and however long I please. And I think just coming back to the body and appreciating this body that carries you through this life that while we're here is so key. The pandemic was a special challenge for a lot of folks on the mental health front, and I think the disordered eating certainly was no exception. I'm curious how you're coping and what you've learned over the years helped you through this kind of unprecedented time.
yeah, I think like that brings up another question someone sent me, about how I learned to relinquish control, or just, let go of the need to feel like in control in life. Because like, I think if there's one thing that the pandemic has taught us over these last couple of years, is that, yeah, there's hardly anything that we control. And that can be really scary, and also in some ways like really freeing, because it's a lot to think about. Like, if you could control all of this, what would you do? It's a lot. So nice not to be in charge of everything, but also in our own personal lives, a feeling like we do have some of that ability, I mean, keeps us sane. So having the illusion of that, is what we have. For me, I guess, having a mindfulness practice, and just actively noticing, the times when there was no way I could possibly, account for everything or be in control of a situation, was helpful. And like, getting used to that also with OCD and the anxiety itself is something that helped, beyond just the eating. I think like for me, especially, if I hadn't have gone through treatment and been in recovery, COVID would have been a lot scarier, because my anxiety disorder was rooted in like contamination fears. And so,
I mean, that explains the OCD too, right? Oh man.
and like OCD, it goes like far beyond hand washing for a lot of people.
Yes.
So like that's just the media,
The popularized expression.
yeah, image like in TV and movies. But yeah, it can be really elaborate. For me, that was part of my experience. And it wasn't really even because I was afraid of getting sick. It was more just about the feeling of it and kind of some underlying, symbols about like what cleanliness means and, what that means like as a person. And kind of, yeah, that gets us to some racialized and yeah, things like that too. But I think, just getting used to like, yeah, things like with the pandemic, you can do, all of the best practices. And, obviously we still see people who are vaccinated and masked, have breakthrough cases. You do the best that you can. And, the same goes with eating or exercising. I think just having an acceptance for change and realizing that, I don't need to check my weight every day because my weight's going to fluctuate throughout the whole day. If I drink the 2 cups of water I have over here, my weight's going to change. And, if I take a shower, my weight's going to change. If I wash my hair, my weight's going to change. That kind of stuff, it like gets you used to the fact that, yeah, it's just a ever evolving thing. And to kind of like let go of some of the need to always know or be in control. And you get used to, some of that discomfort until it doesn't really bother you so much anymore. Yeah, I think that also connects to like, for me, I don't really check, my weight. I have a scale, but I don't really use it. I think the last time I checked my weight was like in 2021. And so for a lot of folks with EDs or history of eating disorders, that's really helpful. And it's something that's good to tell your doctor, to have in your history. And they just recently, I heard a company made, cards that you can either give to your medical professional or whoever else you're seeing to say, please don't weigh me unless it's medically necessary. Because there are times, if you're checking for a health condition or having a screening for something where, it is really good to know. But it's not the only marker of health. And, ideal weight is different for literally everybody. You can be healthy at every size as the, movement of that name says. And yeah, it's really relative. Like I know what average weight is for me, but that's like totally different from BMI actually.
Oh
And
yeah, bone density, muscle mass, all of that, right? Okay. So getting fixated on numbers is the wrong expression of
yeah,
health for sure.
yeah, totally. And so like, for me, I just like really like to highlight that whenever those discussions come up. And I think luckily I hear less of that kind of talk now, but every now and then might be a lunchroom conversation or something where, someone's talking about their either calories or like, the weight. And it's kind of like that stuff's all gonna change. I think there's no number that's a magic number where, once you hit it, you're gonna have your whole life together and be happy and like feel beautiful. And, but it doesn't work that way. I mean, if you've got the anxiety, you still have the anxiety. And so like that underlying stuff is really important to address.
Mhm.
And, the same thing, like with calories, I found it really interesting. Like, I think had this awareness, but to finally read in the past couple of years, that the formula that we're told about, like in health class at school, like the nutrition unit, where, calories in equals calories out, is not like entirely the full story, because
Yeah, I mean, the keto folks will tell you when they're eating cheeseburger patties all day and
yeah,
they're still losing weight because they're cutting out carbs or whatever.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I also like personally don't recommend that because like yeah, who wants to be hangry all the time? But it a lot of those studies are done in a lab, so in vitro results are different than what happens in an actual body. In vivo, um, our bodies are like so much more elaborate in terms of all the processes and things that happen than any kind of lab study. And so like when you're actually eating nutrient dense, like whole food, and especially if somebody like you have more fiber in your diet, or if like it's a cultural thing, you don't actually, you don't digest all that food. And so it's like calories in doesn't equal calories out. You should just eat to, satisfy your hunger. And yeah, it's like you can't really count on the calories, bottom line. So yeah. Um,
Well, it's been popularized, a lot of folks talking about the COVID-19 being like the freshman 15. And I think that's quite a bit of talk. And yeah, it's kind of that unhealthy talk that's out in the ether and in the culture. And I think what you just said is dead on. Fiber is great. Fiber is great.
yeah, especially Americans. I like hear that we haven't always got enough, but yeah, good stuff. um, Somebody was asking me about resources, and
Mhm.
yeah, there are luckily a lot of good resources out there. So I mean, we mentioned that some of these statistics we shared are from the anorexia nervosa and associated disorders um, organization. It's a US based nonprofit. And yeah, they talk about how eating disorders affect, everybody from people of color, BIPOC community, to LGBTQ plus people with disabilities, athletes, veterans, and children. So they're a really great resource. They also have a helpline and peer mentor line. They're based in Chicago. Um, and yeah, peer mentors and support groups can be really amazing resources. You know, after my experience with the OCD and the eating issues, I did get peer counselor certification through the state of Washington. So, it helps me in cases like this where if I feel like, I can support somebody or help other people, then I share my story. But yeah, there are people that you can call who can talk with you one-on-one. And besides Anna, there is NEDA, the National Eating Disorders Association. So yeah, NEDA is the org that gives its name to Need Awareness Week. And they put out a lot of great content this past week. They used to be based in Seattle, and now I believe they're in New York. But they also have a hotline. And yeah, their line, like we said, experienced a major increase during COVID, more people calling them. But yeah, definitely don't stop using those resources. You can call just to talk with someone for support. You can call to get referrals, and all kinds of things. So
Yeah, I've researched, I've just Googled their links and posted them in the group for
yeah,
folks to check out.
awesome. And there are also some really good folks, just as individuals who share good content on social media, although I think it can be like a whole separate topic where we address the things to be mindful about insta therapy, and you know, how just these little bite-sized things that we get online are not, you know, the full story on healing and mental health care, but you know, they can be an introduction to these concepts and to getting support. And you know, I think some folks who are sharing good content are people like a woman who I read about. Her name is Melissa A. Fabello, who has her PhD in treating eating disorders, and you know, specifically she did research on women with anorexia and recovery, and you know, how that affects like their relationships and sensuality, sexuality. So she shared a lot over the past several years about her own experience and also her research. And she wrote a book called Appetites that we can also share a link to later. But yeah, there are a lot of good resources that you can like dive into for more learning. And you know, support groups, workshops for, you know, people who like find that they have OCD or some kind of co-occurring anxiety disorder. There's the OC Foundation nationally, which is an org, you know, in the States, that they have events, or more recently, like during the pandemic, they've had like live streams on their Facebook pretty much monthly, and things on LinkedIn. But they also had an annual OCD conference. And so, you know, if you really are looking for that support, it's out there.
Great. Well, we're coming to the top of the hour, so I want to thank you for sharing, Jordan. Is there any parting words? Anything else you'd like to leave? And yeah, for sure, help us out there. There are a lot of free resources, even for those that can't necessarily find or access paid resources. And of course, I guess the peer counseling is just kind of a free resource that you can support one another with.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I really, it just, you know, thank everybody for joining us and listening, whether you're with us live right now or, you know, catch us later. Really glad to be able to share, and, you know, glad that we could highlight this issue.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your personal story, Jordan. I learned a lot, even just preparing for this talk, and even more chatting with you. So thank you, and have a wonderful Sunday.
Yeah, thank you too.
Bye.